Happy Wednesday, everyone. Happy almost fall season for those who love fall like myself. We are almost there. Almost there. I have 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And for those of you who have joined drop-in hours before, you know I am a military brat and a band nerd, so tend to start on time, but do want to give folks an opportunity to trickle on in the room today. We have an exciting panel, and we never have favorites with drop-in hours, but we did want to end the series talking about how to take care of yourself in the midst of a pandemic. It's been a challenging 16 to 18 months for everyone. And these are two people who I admire as colleagues, as friends who have been on the front lines in their respective industries well before this pandemic dropped on our plates. So I've not introduced myself. My name is Dr. Bobby Banks, and I am joined by an amazing team who helps to facilitate these drop-in hour discussions. And because we continue to evolve and grow based on the needs of historically marginalized populations, this session will also be translated in Spanish. So we will pass the mic over to our Latinx or our Hispanic, our familia, to say more about what Spanish translation will look like and where you can go. And then we'll come on back to the English room.
Yes, good evening and welcome to everybody. We're going to make a quick announcement about interpreting services. For those of you that speak Spanish and want to hear this wonderful presentation in Spanish, please go to your control options and you should see an icon that says interpretation. It usually appears like a little world icon, and then choose Spanish if that is your choice. I'm going to go ahead and explain this in Spanish as well for our Spanish speaking folks. Thank you so much and welcome. Hola, bienvenidos. Estamos ofreciendo servicios de interpretación a español. Por favor, seleccionen el canal de español si quieren escuchar en ese idioma. Básicamente, en sus controles de Zoom aparece un botón redondo como un símbolo de un mundo. Presionen ese botón y luego váyanse a español. Si están en un teléfono o tableta, la forma de seleccionar el idioma es abajo a mano derecha aparecen 3 puntitos. Elige esos 3 puntitos, luego se va para Language Interpretation o interpretación de idioma y luego va a escoger español. Es muy importante que luego presione el botón que dice Done o finalizar para poder empezar a escuchar en español. Gracias y que disfruten el evento. I have gone ahead and made the announcement about interpreting services. Thank you.
Awesome, awesome, awesome. So for those of you who are kind of new to this space, I want to tell you a little bit more about drop-in hours and how we came to creating this space where people can bring their questions and bring their friends. The concept around drop-in hours was to create a space where we could have experts come to you. So I'm sure you're at home, probably have put your children or done the homework or you're a caregiver. We wanted to create a space where experts come to you. And the whole premise is to create a community where you can come, ask your questions, no judgment here. And this is not a place where we are like convincing or coercing or pushing people to do anything. We have always been very intelligent people, and given the correct information, we make very intelligent decisions. And so the premise with drop-in hours is that we ask the experts to drop in, which we have 2 amazing people today, Dr. Jameta Barlow and Dr. Lundy. We then ask them to drop their credentials because there is a lot of noise. If you are on TV, social media, pigeon carrier, or anything else, everyone has an opinion right now. We bring experts who have credentials and we ask them to drop their credentials so you know who they are with no humility. And then that's the last you'll hear, the credentials. And then we ask them to drop knowledge. Based on who they are and what they have done for their careers, we would love for them to share with the community how to navigate this pandemic. And then the very last thing we ask them to do, if you are like me from the I'll age myself. If you're an 80s baby like myself, and you watch Coming to America and Randy Watson was done and he dropped that mic, that is what we want our experts to do when they leave the room. And we do that because we want to leave you with a call to action. There's a lot of information that's going to be shared today, but if there's one thing that our experts want you to walk away with, that's their opportunity. So the chat window is open. Ask your questions. We're actually going to kick off this session with questions, and we always do that so you know that we are listening to you and that we hear you. And so with that being said, I want to go ahead and open the floor to our 2 experts to drop in the community. And I do need to take one moment to really honor the lives that have been lost in the midst of this pandemic. I would be remiss to not talk about the 600,000 plus lives that have been lost, and also the people on the front lines working diligently to make sure that we are able to achieve wellness to the extent that we are, dependent on where we live, and that we have our basic necessities. So a huge thanks to them and what they continue to do, and continued thoughts, continued prayers for the families that have been affected by this pandemic. Then I want to open the floor for our two experts to tell us who you are. We can go in alphabetical order, or we can go by time zone, or we can go by whoever wants to go first. Please drop your credentials and let the people know who you are, what you do.
I think if you went by time zone or alphabetical order, I think Dr. Barlow, that would still mean that you go first. So we'll let you go first, Dr. Barlow. You're welcome to go first. I'm Dr. Ray Lundy, clinical psychologist, licensed clinical psychologist, and I serve as the interim vice president for student affairs and enrollment management at Wiley College, which is a historically Black institution in Marshall, Texas. Additionally, I serve multiple hats. I am the associate vice president for student health counseling and wellness, meaning I'm the primary health administrator on campus. I supervise our health services area. I additionally manage our accessibility services, anything around diversity and inclusion, as well as all wellness, health education stuff on campus. I am also the self-care doc. I have an LLC, and I focus on promoting wellness within communities of color. And this has been a particularly meaningful time for me because I've gotten to extend the work that I've done with the self-care doc, because unfortunately there's been such a need during the pandemic. And so, like I said, Dr. Lundy, clinical psychologist, graduate of Notre Dame, HBCU, Xavier right here, in terms of dropping the mics. And so you know that that PhD was well earned. I tell somebody the other day, they just weren't giving them out at Notre Dame. So I think that one of the things I pride myself on, though, is providing culturally competent care. And I think so much of what I've talked about with folks during this season has been really around feeling safe to talk about what you're needing to talk about, and that doesn't always happen. And so one of the things I'll leave you with is that I'm committed to serving communities of color, providing support around wellness needs. And I'm glad to be here, honored to provide some support and talk about how we can get more in tune with what we need as it relates to self-care during the midst of the pandemic. Such an important topic, and a topic that I think I have a unique way of discussing. And so I can't wait to provide a little bit more insight around what I really think self-care looks like as we extend this conversation. So grateful to be here, and those are my credentials.
I am honored to have you, and I'll talk about both of you. I knew you would be the right people for this session. You also were in New Orleans when Hurricane Katrina hit.
I was.
Yeah.
Yes.
So you have seen disaster. You've been in this field on the wellness and psychology side for a minute, for quite some time. And as she said, you can find her on social media at Self-Care Doc. She is a ray of light. No pun intended. Mm-hmm. A ray of light when it comes to really understanding mental health, mental wellness. And as you heard from her credentials, it's not only in the classroom, it's also out in the community. So thank you. Honored to have you.
Thank you.
All right, back to the Eastern time zone. Dr. Barlow.
Oh my gosh, how do I come after the self-care doc? I'm telling you. It is such an honor and pleasure, Dr. Banks. Thank you for the invitation. And it's my pleasure to be on this panel with Dr. Lundy. My name is Jameta Nicole Barlow, and I wear many hats. The hat I'm most proud of is that I am a Southern Black woman, and that shows up in everything that I do. So professionally, I am an assistant professor of writing and health policy and management, as well as women's gender and sexuality studies at the George Washington on the stolen land of the Nacotchitink people, also known as Washington, D.C. And so that's my primary hat that I wear, especially as school begins to start. But I'm a psychologist, I'm a community psychologist. So it means I don't see clients, but I am a researcher. And so a lot of my perspectives are community-based research, group-based work, group-based interventions. And so I'm also a public health scientist, and I have an MPH in maternal and child health. And so along with that, I have additional trainings as a doula, as a prenatal yoga instructor, as well as a yoga instructor. I'm certified as a vinyasa yoga instructor, as well as restorative yoga, which we'll hear about a little bit later. And I'm also completing training for meditation. And so a lot of my work and my what we call ontologies and epistemologies, the way in which I know the world, the way in which I come into this world of self-care, of wellness, of health promotion, is rooted in Southern Black womanisms, right? Southern Black feminisms. And we have over 100 years of research, of data, of literature from these women. And I use that in my interventions. My first and foremost love is writing. So in my group-based, community-based research, I use writing as healing. And I've conducted healing retreats throughout the world, as well as some that are coming up once it's safe for us to gather together again. But I've done these retreats, local retreats in the DC area, in Baltimore, as well as in Virginia. And so it's my absolute pleasure to be here. My work is rooted in decolonizing approaches, decolonizing methodologies. And so I'll talk about that more later, but that's so important as Brown and Black people, that we understand everything from the languages we speak, English, Spanish, French. These are all colonizing languages, even how we connect. And so when you understand that level of what we need to do in this world to really embrace our natural and our ancestral ways of knowing, it requires us to think about things differently. So my primary area of research is I study trauma, I study intergenerational trauma. And so that's what kind of catapulted me into doing more with self-care, because that's a way of addressing trauma. So again, it's a pleasure to be here. I can't wait for the conversation.
I just dropped the mic. I seriously thank both of you for sharing time out of your day to really talk to folks about what wellness looks like. And Jameta, you are probably one of the most people I know. As I started to really understand trauma generationally as a woman, as a Black woman, I would turn to you a lot and say, and you were just like, been that way, as you have said, been that way for decades, if not centuries. This is how we navigate these waters. So this is important for you to be here, for me to really think about wellness and grounding and strategies to not go with the frustrations that are very real.
Right, we're not new to this.
Yeah, pretty much. I have not said who I am. I am Dr. Bobby Banks, and I am leading the Not a Host campaign. I won't talk about it a lot, but I invite you to go to the Not a Host website, because we have created a digital and print campaign that really encourages Black and Brown people to learn about this pandemic in novel and innovative ways. So drop-in hours is one small piece of an entire campaign that we have rolled out over the past almost 2 years now. And drop-in hours is more specifically made possible by a host of partners. Ride United North Carolina, if you have not heard about, is a conglomerate of partners who understand social determinants of health aren't just words on a piece of paper. It is that people don't have access to health. They don't have access to preventive care. They don't have access, if they choose to get vaccinated, they don't even have transportation to get to and from. And so Ride United is an effort that I'll talk about at the end of this presentation for people who have made the informed decision, because it is a personal decision, to get vaccinated. There are resources to get free round trip transportation as part of the Ride United program. So I want to thank our partners at United Way of the Greater Triangle, Blue Cross Blue Shield North Carolina, Blue Cross Blue Shield North Carolina Foundation, and so many others, Duke and Mako Documents, North Carolina Department of Transportation, North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services. That is how drop-in hours was made possible, because they saw the innovation and really tooling people with information around the pandemic. So this would not be made possible without them, as well as 33 Creatives. All of the beautiful Black and yellow promotion you've seen is from our partners there. This would not be possible without the support. So You have dropped your credentials. We would now like for you to drop knowledge. And we're going to start this off with the Q&A. I've had a great day today. Yes, I have. So people have been having a great day or a great week or quarter or 2 years, and there's some things you want to talk about around mental health, wellness. Please drop, this is your space. So please drop your questions in the chat. But I do want to kick off the Q&A with something that Dr. Sherelle Barber said at the very first drop-in hour. So this is number 4 of 4. And we started off with talking about structures and legacy and systems that have been at play for centuries that have led to the inequities and disparities that most of the world is just seeing with this double pandemic. And so we brought in Dr. Diane Rowley, who is the widow of Dr. Bill Jenkins, who was the whistleblower for the Tuskegee syphilis study, and Dr. Sherelle Barber, who to me is like, if you're passing the baton in the racial equity space, she is running it's a long name, but the Ubuntu Center up in Philadelphia at Drexel University. And she said a quote when she dropped her mic that was so poignant. And I think it ties into this session extremely well. And I'm going to read it verbatim. When she had her drop the mic moment, she said, I think it's really important for us to recognize that for some individuals and communities, the pandemic has been an inconvenience. For some individuals and communities, it has literally shattered their lives. And so she says, my thing is, let us not forget the lessons. What was revealed to us in this pandemic, we owe it to the lives that have been lost to use our lives and the breath we have to fight for the kind of equitable world that we all deserve. So we know the fight for equity, for fairness, for access and opportunity for our families, ourselves, and our communities can be exhausting. It can be frustrating. The pursuit of normalcy or normal life can also be exhausting and frustrating. How do you balance this fight, and how do you see the difference between people surviving and thriving? It's kind of loaded. Or what's your daily? I know you are a yoga person, Jameta. What are your preventive or the preemptive things you kind of do to stay ahead?
All right, so there's a lot there, so I'll just kind of jump in. One, I will say regarding the fight is that what's so important for people of color, for Black and Brown, Indigenous people, is that we have a voice and we exhibit agency. And so what's different about self-care for someone say, oh, I'm gonna go get a massage, I'm gonna get a mani-pedi. That can be a form of self-care for some people. But for Black people, often advocating for ourselves, being able to have a voice, being able to have agency, that is a form of self-care. But what can happen in that protest world, that activist world, is that you don't rest, you don't take care of yourself. And so there's a fine line. And so in this moment, that's a fine line that we all have to figure out where we stand on that. For me, I do a lot of ritual, which I'll talk about later. Ritual is something that is our ancestors. That's what they did. There were rituals. So I engage in ritual, and they consist of a lot of different modalities. But for me, they're everything from daily walks to prayer to meditation, spending time outside with the sun, in the grass, in the soil, with animals, with vegetables. And as a result of that, I'm connected to the earth. I'm more connected to that spirit, right? This spirit, you mentioned Ubuntu, the center that Dr. Barber is running, but Ubuntu means that I'm not here alone. It's like I go far because we all go far.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so that idea means that I'm not disconnected from the earth. And so when you're in periods like this, where you are literally being harmed physically, emotionally, you have to maintain and foster that connection. And so for me, it's connecting to the ancestors in many different ways. It's all of the other things that I mentioned as well. And it's understanding that taking care of yourself isn't something that's selfish. It's something that's required as sustenance, as fuel. And that's what I've been doing.
Mm-hmm. All right. I didn't mean to get in your personal business, but I was just curious. Okay. Dr. Lundy.
I think everything that Dr. Barlow mentioned, I would come in agreement with. I think, though, for me, I start by asking the simple question of what is it that I need in this moment? It's really, for me, a moment by moment awareness. Self-care, as she mentioned, can often be really passive or external. But I really like to think about self-care from an active place, meaning that rather than it being something that I do in retrospect or after I've been exhausted, burnt out, and overextended, it becomes really being in tune and connected, as Dr. Barlow said, connected by really asking myself that question, what is it I need in this moment? And so often when we are in the fight, this dual fight that we're talking about, we're on autopilot. And we're going from moment to moment without really having connected and tuned in to what it is that we're in need of. And I think really for me, by asking that simple question, I've been able to provide myself with the self-care that I need, that really, it extends beyond, like I said, that passive self-care, and that kind of the things that we look back at in retrospect. And I think for me, it also becomes recognizing that self-care is it can happen in real time. So often we think, again, about self-care as something that takes a lot of time. It's going to take resources and money. And then as we're thinking through this equity and this access piece, that can be a cognitive barrier for us when we think through, okay, I don't have the time, I don't have the money or the resources, or from a cultural perspective, we don't give ourselves permission because society has told us that we can't. And so I think if we reframe it into this more, again, this moment by moment right that I have to be connected to wellness and granting myself that permission, I think then we're able, for me, I've been able every day to wake up and say, okay, what is it that I need today? What is it that I need in this moment? Because without doing that, again, I overextend myself, and I get into places of burnout. And so that's been a simple thing. I think the other things that I heard Dr. Barlow mention, for me, nature is so restorative. Even if folks are familiar with the idea of grounding, taking my shoes off and placing my feet in the earth, right? It just realigns my central nervous system. And I think that's important to talk about, that with this trauma that we are all experiencing, our central nervous systems have become dysregulated, and they are constantly in fight or flight. So we're elevated and kind of just almost like buzzing all the time, even if we're not aware of it. So it's so important in this conversation around self-care, because what we give ourselves the permission to do is to regulate. And so things like walking in nature, grounding, conversations with people that feel safe. So much of what's happening are things that remind us that we're not safe. And so connecting with the people who remind us that we're safe. And I think really a way to tie up what I'm sharing is, for me, a framework that really helps is thinking about our wellness wheel. So the 8 areas of wellness, where I look at social wellness, spiritual wellness, physical wellness. For me, self-care becomes about looking at all of those things and asking that question, though, that I started with, which is, what is it that I need in this moment? And how can I tap into the 8 areas of wellness as a way of really helping myself heal? Because I think self-care is healing.
I'm so glad you mentioned that fight or flight response. It takes me back to biology and like Miss Terry, shout out to Miss Terry, Newport News Public Schools in Virginia, of how our bodies have a mechanism. If we see a grizzly bear, we have a mechanism either to put our gums up and fight the bear, or Jackie Joyner Kersey and run from the bear. That is the fight or flight. It is a temporary response. Temporary.
It's
your
supposed to be temporary, right?
Exactly. So your body should not be coasting in fight or flight, that's underlying so many other chronic issues, which I'm sure Jameta can talk about. But this whole thing that's supposed to be temporary, your body is coasting. Our bodies weren't designed to do that. And so thinking about all of the things you just talked about that people don't think about, sitting outside in the sun is vitamin D. I mean, if we want to go to the science, right? Deep breathing gives you more oxygen. All of these things will go back to like the biological area. Shout out to Newport News Public School. Thank you for mentioning that. The other thing I want to say, thank you for mentioning, both of you are familiar with the Envision series that we have done as part of this work. But one thing that I'm a huge proponent of, particularly after I experienced grief after my mother passed away, because 2 women of color told me, was that I needed to get a paid friend. And for those who don't understand, it is a Dr. Ray Lundy, right? So finding a therapist, finding someone who is trained in psychology, mental health and wellness. It could be a naturopath, it can be a natural healer, but someone who has trained in these areas so that you can have someone outside of your sphere of everyday people to speak to. And so one of the wise things that I was told, and you talked about burnout, was that you have to be present enough to know before you hit that wall. Because you said autopilot, if you're in this equity space or you're just life and you got to do for yourself, got to be a caregiver for the kids, got to be a caregiver for my mom, got to do this, got to do that. You don't see it until you hit it. And one of the things that really take us out is the silent killer, your blood pressure. And you often don't feel it until it's kind of too late. And so one of the things I've had to be intentional about is slowing down and checking in. When you said that, I'm like, I'm doing my homework from years ago. But when many of us saw this pandemic coming down the pike, we knew data-wise what was happening. I also knew Bobby-wise, I think everyone knows, extrovert is me. And I knew that was going to be real then. And I was like, but I know I love flowers. So I started having a weekly rotation of natural flowers. I love rocking chairs, really random. Sat on a rocking chair with some sweet tea and some coffee. And so I love that you said the autopilot analogy and people needing to check in with themselves and do what works for them. I wasn't going to go to a massage parlor. I just needed some flowers and some coffee. That's all I needed. So thank you for mentioning those. I'm looking at comments in the chat. Okay. I'm sorry, random thread. Did you know both of your middle names were Nicole?
I did not know that.
I did not know that. Hi, Nicole.
Destiny.
But one thing I do want to just add to what you said, Dr. Banks, is that, I just gave a self-care talk to incoming students at GW yesterday. And one thing, I was presenting with 2 other women. And one thing I like to remind people, not everybody is Zen and wants to do yoga and meditation. That's not for everybody. Everybody likes outside. If you're like me, I like outside, but I get bit. I've been bitten by everything this summer. Spiders, these larvae eating mites from the cicadas. Like, it's all kinds of craziness that's been out. That's not for everyone. And so what I encourage people to also do is to make a list of all your favorite things. And some of those are healthy, right? That list, spread them throughout your day. Again, it comes back to ritual, right? So it's creating ritual in your life so that it becomes a habit, it becomes a lifestyle, and it's not, as Dr. Lundy was mentioning, reactive to the moment. But when you have ritual, it's why there's so much ritual and customs and tradition with our ancestors. No, they didn't have psychologists. No, they didn't have all these Western notions that we do today, but they have ritual. Customs, coming together, dancing, all of these things we know really turn the tide on these issues. And yes, to decreasing cortisol in our body that leads to all of those chronic health diseases. So we want to activate that parasympathetic nervous system. Yes.
Okay. Well, you were in Roanoke Public Schools. What school district were you in Virginia?
So let's be clear. I am a native of Charlottesville, Virginia.
That's what I said. Absolutely.
Yes. But my family is from Roanoke, Virginia.
Okay.
about 2.5 hours away. So shout out to my family. But no, I went to Albemarle County Public Schools.
Okay. My apologies. I try. Clearly, this is not a major television network where we have all of our. Okay, would love to hear from folks in the chat. We've never done this before, but would love to hear from you. We'll see them on this end. Some of the things that you have done. Dr. Barlow just talked about creating a list. And it could be the smallest of small things. My treat was going to Cocoa Cinnamon a week ago. I can go there and practice Spanish with my friends there, the baristas, and get a churro. That was my treat. Happy, couldn't tell me anything, but would love to hear from folks in the chat what you have done. We're in the fourth wave of the pandemic. Oh, go ahead. You have something else to add?
Well, I was going to say one thing I always like to tell people, and I love your example, but also like taking care of yourself doesn't have to be transactional. Okay. So what do I mean by that? It doesn't have to be, oh, I did this, so I deserve this. Right? Look, if you want to walk outside, if it motivates you to complete something to do that, that's fine. But you just walk outside. It's okay to get what you got, right? That's fine. So to get out of like, I'm not deserving of it. No, you deserve it just for your own well-being. It doesn't have to be transactional.
And that's what I tell people when they try to judge me with my crab legs. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, we don't need so not only is it not transactional though, it is, or I don't want to say should be, but it should be an integrated part of our lives. It was taken from us. We're talking ancestrally. We were not given permission to rest. And so there's a cognitive shift that has to happen for us because we think that we have to earn the right to rest. Whereas as a human basic need, our bodies, nature, all things, they go in cycles and there is rest integrated in there. And so for us to think or to be conditioned to believe that we have to keep going, that is actually counterproductive to our natural human tendency to self-preserve. And so we're going, the superwoman complex or all of the things that go against our natural tendency, which says that rest is a part of the process. Rest is in fact productive, right? And so I love what Dr. Barlow mentioned about it not being transactional. But for me, it's even an extension beyond that, in that like it is not even just habitual, it is a part of my living, breathing human experience. And introducing that and encouraging folks to recognize that it's just part of what I feel like my life's mission is. Like anytime someone says, yeah, but it is a part of our living experience. So.
That just hit me. We were not given permission to rest. And that crosses so many cultures. Yeah. And how to shift that paradigm that it is a part of productivity, as you said. One thing that Dr. Barlow and I both had training as young researchers over in Europe. I was in Switzerland and I was at the World Health Organization and she was in Paris. I have the correct city this time, Paris. And they shut down. You get your lunch and then they shut down and then they open back up at dinner again. It is cultural and rest is built into the day. And that was a little bit of culture shock, even being a military child, that a siesta is fine. You can rest. And it's actually quite restorative. And I've called Dr. Barlow several times and she's going into a nap or coming out of a nap. So it reminds me to sit myself down and that rest is necessary. Disconnect, turn it off. And people are putting in the chat, saying no is a form of self-care as well. Somebody else is saying a midday rest break. Yeah, they are everything. Do you have recommendations how people can plan to rest more? Dr. Barlow, Queen of Naps.
Yes, I do have recommendations for people to rest more, but I also want, one thing that I always say, I'm also part of my training in meditation right now. I'm in yoga nidra training with Tracy Stanley. And I recommend her book that's out now called Radiant Rest. It's absolutely amazing. But there's a difference between rest and sleep. And a lot of people don't know the difference. So the sleep thing is you should get a minimum of 7 to 8 hours of sleep. If you're not getting that, and a lot of people think they are, like I typically do, but the last 6 weeks, I thought I was getting it. Then I was tracking my sleep and I wasn't. I noticed a difference and I couldn't figure out what it was. And now I know it was the sleep. And so life happens. You might have things going on in your life where you don't get as much sleep as you normally do. So that's normal. But we also know during the pandemic, people were having nightmares. People are clenching their jaws at night. I was with a colleague the other day and she said she's lost 3 teeth because she's been clenching her jaws. These things are happening. Part of the work that we need to do in our own healing is body awareness. And that's why I love meditation, because it's taught me even more body awareness. And as a result of that, I pay attention to my biorhythms. I don't fight the urge to go to sleep. My body is trying to tell me it's time to rest or time to get sleep. Now, sleep is what you need because your body, like a computer, has to reboot. Your brain needs rest. Even, and I'm fascinated with liver, and Dr. Banks knows this, I'm fascinated with like different organs of the body and how to make sure that they're healthy. And I tell people like, your liver is something you need to take care of. Of course, it's more than just not drinking a lot of alcohol, but your liver actually processes so much. And a lot of people never reach rapid eye movement, right? And that's that moment where your body is really regenerating. It's healing, it's doing all the work. But that hour after, and you might go through rapid eye movement several times, but there's usually a longer chunk in your rapid eye movement time where about an hour or 2 hours after, that's when your liver is regenerating. And it's a fascinating process. But if you never get enough sleep, if you never make it to rapid eye movement, like that deep sleep, that's what rapid eye movement is, that very deep sleep. I'm talking like, you wake up with like, drooling, whatever kind of things happen, right? And what's happening is your liver processes everything that comes to your body. So your food, your drinks, and can lead to a lot of the things that we're talking about in terms of chronic disease. So sleep has so many effects on hormones that we could talk forever about. And so sleep is one thing. So do what you need to do to create body awareness so you understand how to get more sleep. Right? So yeah, you might not get to 8 hours this week, but maybe if you're doing 5 hours, get to 6 and move to 7. Be patient with yourself in the process. And then I just want to mention rest a little bit. I know I'll mention it later, but with rest, what's so critical about rest is that it's not watching TV. It's not reading a book. Rest is actually doing nothing. And some people are like, well, I have to do something. I'm going to do whatever. And that's why I actually like meditation, because it teaches you how to rest. And so coming to stillness, allowing everything to just be. Many different ways to do that.
Often some of the self-care that we've done or been taught is things that we think are self-care are really distractions or escapisms. And so as Dr. Barlow is talking, when she's talking about rest, it really is, a moment where we're not distracting ourselves with Netflix or, the many things we might distract ourselves with, and allowing there to be moments of silence and pause. I hesitate though, even as I say that, because we want to always find balance in these conversations to say that if you are needing to escape, that's real because of what's happening around us. So it isn't about shaming ourselves into thinking that, oh, I've been doing it wrong. Really, these conversations about helping us to shift our paradigm, shift our way of thinking, because we've been, again, the autopilot or the socialization. But when we are allowing ourselves to rest, when we are allowing ourselves to pause, it's important that if you're beginning this practice to recognize that it also may be challenging. I think as we introducing all of these new concepts, give yourself the grace. And that's something that I will, kind of extend throughout anything I'm sharing this evening, because the grace, the compassion, not shaming ourselves, all of these things I think are going to be really important for us to implement the things that we've been discussing. So I really wanted to say that, yes, actually, absolutely everything Dr. Barlow is saying, and it's not going to be easy to begin these practices because we're retraining our brain, our mind, our heart, our bodies. All of us, we're shifting. It's a paradigm shift.
And knowing yourself, as Dr. Barlow has said, going outside and being in the grass. I can't do that in my neighborhood because I'm going to talk to everybody. So I know when I need to restore, I go to Duke Gardens, right? I go and that has meaning for me for several reasons, but I go there because I can just watch nature. And so I know that is a place I go for solitude and grounding. Or sometimes just sitting here and just putting on some white noise or some good old FAMU music. I don't know if that's considered rest, but I love hearing my band just play. I'm a percussionist, so I love hearing drums. Someone in the chat has a really good question. And so and I think all of us here have an opportunity or have a privilege of being able to work from home. And that is not the case for many people who come from communities where people look like us. Black, Latino, Asian Pacific Islanders, Native American or First People are the people who are on the front line at the grocery or at the front line. We often think about doctors or nurses, but it's also the people in food service. It's also people in housekeeping. It's also could be physicians. It's the people who are I don't want to call it logistics, who are making sure we have everything we need in our grocery stores. It's the folks driving the FedEx trucks and the Amazon trucks. How do they find a glimpse of, or what recommendations do we have for them other than celebrating them and saying thank you? What ways can these individuals embed wellness or self-care as part of their work?
My answer is the same. Having family members in these areas, I have these conversations. It's the same. It's finding out what brings you joy in the world and sprinkling that throughout your day. And for some people who have the means to do like the mani-pedi massage and all of that, great. But if it's taking a minute to walk around the corner, it's as simple as that, walking your child to school. It's what we can do to honor these folks, though, is to treat everyone a little bit better. So what if your package was delayed, right? I remember when that was happening, a lot of mail was delayed. People were really upset. It's really beyond our control, right? And so it's having a little bit more compassion for those who are in those roles, but also understanding that they have different limitations. What I used to do in talks, I remember I was in a conversation with colleagues and everybody was talking about all the banana bread they were making. And I said, well, let's first also thank all of the people who delivered your groceries, who bagged your groceries, who put their families at risk very early on in the pandemic, before we were wearing masks and all of those things, who were literally putting their lives on the line. And so I think it's an understanding of how we can treat each other better, but also recognize that when you know yourself and know and are able to listen to what your body needs, sleep, rest, or whatever it is, food, water, it's making sure that people have access to that. So we can fight to make sure that people have clean water, access to food, jobs that pay them with health insurance, et cetera. And those are ways in which we can support and be allies. But we're able to access all of these things. Walking, if you're able to walk, being in community with one another, engaging in ritual. And those are free.
Yeah, that's where I was going to go, because the question, inherent in the question, is that there are some resources that we might have that they don't have, or the luxury. And there is truth to that, right? Our means are different. But I think what I want to make sure I underscore around my perspective on self-care, that it is the different way that I'm wanting us to view it is that it isn't about accessing something outside of ourselves or an additional resource. It is really about how we can tune into and connect with self and shift the way we think about it. We carry ourselves everywhere where we're going. So for our brothers and sisters or folks who are, whose means are different, as they are taking their child to school, as they are, I'm looking at the question, all of the ways in which they are overextended and their lives and our lives, all of our lives, the ways in which those things are maybe not at liberty to have the extra self-care, our moment by moment experience. I'll give you the practical example. Someone doesn't have a car. They don't have the luxury of listening to music in the car on the way to work that would, or even for folks in the middle of a pandemic, just sitting in your car and getting away from your house as a space. They may not have that luxury, but if they are walking their child to school, that is a moment of connection. That can be a moment of self-care. What I would say is that then we think about that moment differently. It's again, this coming out of the autopilot. A lot of times we are not connecting to our experiences, and there are experiences that can be healing and affirming. So if we are amongst family, in those instances of folks that we're talking about in this question, those moments with family can be viewed differently. It's the same, so we can have the same experiences, but how we're viewing those experiences can then be restorative and healing. If we're having those experiences and they have been ones where they are, where our focus is on what we don't have and how our stressors have overwhelmed us versus our perspective about those experiences have shifted, then they can be the same experience, but they can be moments of restoration. I'll give you a perfect example. I work with college students, and our college students have recently gone through a campus-wide quarantine because we had high cases of COVID-19. Most of our college students come from homes where there is food insecurity at the home. Like, being at college is the thing that is saving them, or that they don't have options to go home. So when we shut down the campus, there were some folks for whom it felt like an inconvenience to the speaker who you've had before. But there were some students for whom they had the exact same experience, and the shutdown, their perspective on it was different. And it was a moment for them to rest, to feel safe. So it was about how those students had the exact same experience. And they approach that experience with a different mindset. And so for me, what I'm saying for folks, I'm not putting the blame or onus on our brothers and sisters to say, well, just think about it differently. What I am saying, though, is when we're able to look at what's happening and tune in to say, in this experience, what about this experience can allow me to feel some form of rest? Hugging my child as I take them to school, if I just did that, hugging, connection, physical touch is healing. So if we walk to work with or walk to school, walking our child to school, if we just make that small change, same amount of time that we're walking them there, but we hugged the child, that's healing. Our nervous system calms. We talked about the cortisol. For my students, the students who were in the room and feeling overwhelmed and frustrated and calling me and saying, Dr. Lundy, I don't have those same students. When we talked and they called and said, well, Dr. Lundy, what can I do with my time? Same experience, but they had a categorically different experience. So I think what I want folks to see is that, we may not have the resources, and that's the unfortunate reality. And as allies, as Dr. Barlow said, it is our job and responsibility to create equity or increase those resources. But moving from a place of feeling powerless and as if we are not able to, helping folks to do that, I think is part of the work of healing. And so, like I said, walking to work, walking to school, if that's the experience, and walking with bags, making sure that then folks know I can hug my child. That makes me feel better. That actually calms me, and it calms my child. And that is actually a moment of self-care.
Hugs are everything. When I tell you, folks were hurting on so many levels. from limited social interaction, but I would have paid for a hug. I'm just not that adventurous in the midst of a global pandemic, but I think there are science behind just hugging somebody for a couple of seconds lowers your cortisol levels. And folks would, if people don't understand cortisol, please explain that more to them. And then we always offer the presenters an opportunity to like, hey, if you want to drop some slides and drop some knowledge for the people. And then we ask the audience, like, do you want them to do the slides or you want to keep doing the Q&A? And it varies. So we're going to let Dr. Barlow say her comment, and I'm going to see if folks want to go into some slides, some convo, and then I cannot, this time always flies. It's almost 7 o'clock. Please go ahead, Dr. Barlow.
And I'm okay either way. We can keep talking or do slides. One thing I just wanted to add to what Dr. Lundy said was, I don't know if you saw a lot of those videos of kids walking to school and their parents having them recite affirmations. So that's another example of how you can bring in what I call decolonizing methodologies, right? You're taking words that are so powerful, ritual, and inserting that into your day. And that's so important, not only for their self-esteem and body image, but it goes further in how they're connecting with that child. But I do want to make sure that we answered her question, because one thing, or his question, I don't know who posted it.
Her. I think it's her.
The one thing that, the reason why Black people survived the 1918, those who did survive the 1918 pandemic, was because we had each other. If you look at that, it was self-determination. It was mutual aid and support. So, dear sister, if you see a need, create it, address it. Because that's how we survived before. I have a cousin who saw a need in her church family and just started cooking dinners for the older people in the church family. And that became something she did during the pandemic, right? No one told her to do it. She didn't ask, she just did it. So if there is something that you see as a need, you know more than I do, because I think what you're asking is coming from a place of need and you're seeing something, then maybe it's an opportunity for you to partner with other people and create change around it. That's what we do. And that's why I said earlier on that having agency, having a voice, that is part of our own self-care. We thrive when we can help each other.
Mm-hmm. Two things. You just re-sparked in me why we even kicked off the Not a Host campaign. There were a few of us who are familiar with epidemiology and public health, and saw just all of the confusion with the messaging and thought, hey, we can put some cayenne pepper and some Tabasco on this messaging to help people understand. We didn't have an expectation of anyone else to do it. We wanted to support the messaging that was out and to infuse it with culture. And you see what came of that. So never minimize your power for the person who asked the question and leading the charge and supporting people, whether it's on the education side, as we are really advancing health literacy, or as you have just said, Jameta, cooking or providing a gas card. Like, you just never know what things are available. One more thing, and then we'll do a temperature check with the participants. Cortisol, for folks who don't know, is a stress hormone. When you are stressed, those levels shoot up. Inflammation, like so many bad things. And one thing you just said was folks were clenching their teeth. And I remember that was a headline that dentists were like, everybody's in my office. And I saw a couple of friends on social media who had night guards added to their routine because they were grinding their teeth in their sleep from the stress. And I don't know if that's associated with cortisol or not, but I know it is your body is responding to stress. How else do people know they're not well, right? I talked about cardiovascular disease or heart disease. People find out, they might have high blood pressure, but how else do people know they are not mentally or emotionally well? I know a lot of people had fog, like memory and concentration issues in the pandemic. Like, how do people tell folks some of the things you have seen in your practice, or what folks can observe as part of not being an autopilot?
Yeah, I think because we are on autopilot and sometimes not tuned into ourselves, sometimes it takes someone else. So our relationships with others. So I tend to be a very, in my normal ideal self, I think that I am warm and inviting and approaching. And yeah, my close friends though, when I'm not well, I am snappy. I am like real short tempered. And the women in my life, the women in my circle who love me like sister, who are my sisters, they will be like, how are you doing today? And so sometimes it takes that external mirror for me to know. And again, my normal temperament is warm and inviting, and it's not that way when I'm not well. I think another for me, and then for my clients that I see often, we've talked a little bit about it, but just kind of the physical body aches or the physical reactions that one might have. So you talked about hypertension. It can be physical as something as simple as your gastric system, your digestive system. So not digesting your food in the same way, not releasing waste in the same way. So, we're supposed to release at least once a day, multiple times a day. When folks are stressed, they can go several days, or what a real indicator is. So I can say you're supposed to go several days, but you're like, I never go several days. Really what we want to see is our rhythm is off. Go every day, and it now becomes every 3 days in terms of releasing. Or if some folks are like, I don't need 8 hours of sleep, Dr. Barlow. I never needed 8 hours of sleep. Okay, whatever. Not true, but we support that. That's what you feel. But if your rhythm is off and you normally get 6 hours, but now you notice that you're only getting 3 or 2, then that might mean that you're approaching a space where you want to be more in tune with that. So that's the physical stuff. And then I talked relational, and I think you talked cognitive. So that cognitive fog, emotional, behavioral, these are the areas that you want to just pay attention to. When your routine or what you typically do, when you notice that shift, or if others notice that shift, then that may be an indicator that something is not quite right and that you're not well. And then I think a final one I'll say, and I'll extend to Dr. Barlow, is if you're having intrusive thoughts, if you're having thoughts of harming yourself, suicide, that's a really strong indicator. And I go directly for mentioning that because that's too often in our communities, we are staying away from having those conversations. And suicidal ideation, those things happen a lot more frequently than we are comfortable talking about. And that's definitely an indicator that that we're not in the best space if you start to having those types of thoughts.
Dr. Lundy, I'll say I've never met the other persona that your friends have identified.
Oh, it's there.
But I will say, in full transparency, my friends have named mine Cranky Banks. And so I know when Cranky Banks is identified, that I need to reel it on in. I need to disconnect. I need to go outside. I need to go on a walk with somebody. But having true and honest friends are everything. And I've had that name for quite some time. So folks know, particularly when it comes to logistics and getting things ready, Cranky Banks, so I fully understand. And that is a great one to observe. Curt and just agitated easily.
Yeah, irritable mood.
Oh, yeah. That pandemic last year. Yes, ma'am. Okay, Dr. Barlow.
Yeah, I'd like.
Oh, we had weekly flowers, but go ahead, Dr. Barlow.
Well, no, and I do weekly flowers too. I like flowers, but I've done this for years, since, about 10 years now. Flowers by the bed, flowers in my living room space. I like fresh flowers. But one thing I want to add to what Dr. Lundy was saying in response to your question is I kind of look at it as a seesaw, right? And so when we think about a seesaw, the goal is to stay balanced, but there are going to be times when you go up and down depending on who's on the other end. And I say the same thing in life. For a lot of Black people and brown people and other people of color, life has always been kind of imbalanced, but then this pandemic happened and it became even more imbalanced. So what you probably knew as your normal became even more off balance during the pandemic. And so your gauge, everything probably looks different. All the things that Dr. Lundy mentioned, they probably were affecting you, or it was the other extreme. I think about people who have persistent diarrhea, right? And not so much constipation, but it's diarrhea. So think about it's either more than or less than that. Something is off, right? So that's really your indicator. You know your body, you normally do this, and you're like, well, the pandemic, I'll blame it on COVID, right? But then it could be more than that. And so it's always good to talk to a healthcare professional if something like that is going on, something is really off. So that is a major indicator. The other thing I want to tell people is that this is a normal response to everything that's happening. We have racial trauma that's ongoing since Black people were brought to this country and brown and indigenous people have been here, right? We have that's been ongoing, but that came to a head last year publicly, right? I don't know any other group of people that have to see Black death on television over and over and over. And that has an impact. So we have that layered by the pandemic. And I remember last year, and I have several quotes that I've said on this publicly, but I remember saying, like, people aren't worried about a pandemic right now. They're trying to not get killed by the police. They're trying to not get killed by their significant other, because domestic violence, interpersonal violence in the Black community is rarely talked about. And our numbers are high. We're high last year. We also don't talk about that our babies are killing themselves. The increase in suicide has happened around young Black male children, young Black girls too, but young Black males are the numbers right now. We're talking 5 and under killing themselves. So we have to talk about what's going on in the lived experiences of all of these people. And then you throw a pandemic in there, right? So there's a lot. And so part of that is we have to shift culturally. We have to shift how we think about life, how we live life, how we interact with one another. And part of that is going back to our ancestors and our roots of ritual. Have to be the ritual of religions, or if you think it's all spooky, whatever. I'm not talking about that, but for your family, for your network, what are things that you can do every day and sprinkle that throughout your week, throughout your family? That's how we change that. That's how we improve. And that's how we really find a way to cope through this. That is a decolonizing practice. It's understanding our relationship to the land, whose stolen land it was, the fact that Black and brown bodies were enslaved to work the land, and how capitalism grew out of that. So when we disrupt that process, when we thrive and we're healthy, the biggest thing we can do is to be healthy and to thrive. And we can do that. History has shown we can do that. And we do that by taking care of ourselves and being healthy. That's the biggest threat to white supremacy.
One of the things we talked about, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead, Dr. Lundy.
I was so much there.
I'm just like, whoo.
Yeah. Something came to mind though, as you were talking. We named all of these outward, external ways. We talked about that balance. I love that. But an indicator that we may forget about, and that may make it hard to do the ritual and all of those healing things that we've mentioned, is actually becoming numb. And becoming numb is a trauma response. And so if we're saying that, oh, you'll be doing something different, maybe you won't be feeling or doing anything, because in response to trauma, you may, a coping mechanism may be that you shut off. We are desensitized and overstimulated with so many images and experiences of pain and the complex trauma that actually you may begin to feel nothing. So I thought it important that we really mention that piece, because maybe folks are like, I'm not experiencing any of that. I mean, I'm sleeping, or I guess I am, but really recognizing that sometimes it's the numbness that tells us that we're not well also.
And some of the things that we talked about in the first session, thank you for adding that. Yeah, the need to disconnect. But what you made me think of as part of this double pandemic, Dr. Barlow, was people have other things to worry about on a regular day. And one of the things that Dr. Barber did during the first session was land acknowledgement, as you have also done there in DC. But in watching the headlines, right? So you just talked about on a regular day, folks trying not to get shot down by the police. People are trying not to get deported because of a, quote, illegal or quote, immigrant status. And the thing that really blew my mind at the height of the pandemic, where I said, wow, was when Doctors Without Borders had to come to our country to save the lives of First people at the height of this pandemic. Doctors Without Borders is an international crisis organization, and they had to come to the wealthiest country on the earth to save first people's lives. And that to me was a point where I became numb, honestly, where like floating between hopelessness and helplessness was definitely at that point, knowing that the struggles of so many historically marginalized folks reared their ugly heads, and folks saw the double pandemic. But when I saw Doctors Without Borders had to come to the United States of America before Native communities were wiped out, that was one of those points, definitely for me, where I had to pull back and reset and restore. And I don't know if you guys remember that, but it was not a big headline, but I saw it and I was quite disturbed by it. Sorry, I thought about that when you talk about what people got to worry about on a regular day. Sorry. So in the Q&A, folks, we'll do we normally do a reaction tab, but in the Q&A, let us know if you want to keep doing a Q&A, no pun intended, Q&A, or if you want to go into speaker slides. So you can just put Q&A or slides, and I'll go into another one of the chat. Oh, thank you for sharing these resources.
Yeah, and I just realized I was sending it to panelists and not yeah, if you can share them with the panelists. I've spent a lot of time talking about this. There's a video in there where I've talked about some of these issues. These are just extra resources. So if someone could share that with everyone else, that'd be great.
Oh yeah, someone asked, do you want this article shared with everyone or just the panelists? Everyone, you could do it.
Yeah, okay, I didn't know how to, I'm slow.
It's okay. Part of Zoom learning in the pandemic. Okay, yeah, so we have a couple votes for continued Q&A. We'd love to hear from other folks. You want to keep the Q&A going, or you want to go with speaker slides? Well, see what other folks
sharing are in my slides, so we don't necessarily have to do slides. Okay. So unless you want to, it's up to you, Dr. Lundy. I'm either or.
It's so funny. Every time we have speakers, they're like, can we get the contact information? Where do they live? It's just like.
No, I think the converse, well, back to what you talked about, Dr. Barlow, about our ancestry, or just kind of the ways in which we are wired. I think conversation, narrative, being able to feel comfortable talking about these things is really critical. So we could go to slides, but I think if in doing it in this fashion allows us to, I think, demystify a lot of this stuff. A lot of times people think that mental health and wellness and self-care, that there's more of a science to it or a formula. And we've mentioned cortisol levels and parasympathetic nervous system and all those things. Yes, very true. But this conversation, I think, really kind of drills it down in a way that hopefully is helping folks to feel connected. I do know we had a question that we missed in the comment section about appreciating the conversation about college campuses. And the question was about, do faculty need to stay off campus due to high risk of negative outcomes for racial disparities? So I wanted to make sure we went back to that. And Dr. Banks, you can.
So I'm happy. I'm happy to pose that question. I know that that different campuses have different policies. I am always, because I was trained in public health, all of my personal opinions are around public health. And given Dr. Rowley talked about this during the very first session, we don't know what all of these variants are capable of. What Dr. Viviana and Dr. Burgess talked about in the third session was, as long as we have all of these variables out here, we have vaccinated, unvaccinated, we have masked, we have unmasked, we have going back to school, we have virtual, we have hybrid, we have travel, we have all of these things. It's very different from doing, just watching plants grow. We're not static. We're moving human beings. And so I would lean towards whatever is the best public health decision-making to keep everyone at the lowest risk possible of getting this virus. And so I can't speak on university policy. I will say, I was speaking with a professional today. I have no desire to go indoors. I come from a long lineage of nurses. My mom used to always say she's not losing her license for anybody. And she always did things by the book. And for me, it's exactly what Dr. Riley said in the first session. We don't know what these variants are capable of. We're on Delta right now. For those of you who aren't familiar with how these variants are named, it's basically with the Greek alphabet now. And so we had an original variant that popped up early 2020, and then Alpha, Beta. We are now on Delta. And there's nothing else that viruses do. They look for a host so that they can multiply, and they mutate, or you get variants. And that's going to continue until we have hit a point where the majority of the population is protected. So for me, I would hope that the decisions of the institutions would be to protect faculty and students by taking the best public health measures to keep everyone at risk. And for me, I am not taking off my mask until we are out of this pandemic, because we know that this vaccine works beautifully on the variant or the original virus that was here, but we don't know what's going to happen with Gamma, Omega, and the other ones that might pop up. So that is my opinion. I am not a faculty member on campus, but for me, and I know how my mother also operates, I'm going with public health safety and what will reduce the risk for everyone, which is minimal people, minimal interaction, and masks. That's me.
So my greatest stressor right now is, I talked earlier about being so I'm leading the task force at my college to determine what are the best practices and the policies for keeping folks safe. And what has been most challenging is exactly what you said, Dr. Banks, which is that there are so many variables to consider, and the challenge of managing all of those variables at the same time, particularly if I'm thinking about our students for whom they've been at home for 15, 16 months. And now, because for us, we've just welcomed students back on campus, whereas many other campuses open. And so it has been one of the greatest challenges of my life, I would say, to think through, how does this look? And even when I know best practices, the resistance we receive from folks because of the personal choice that folks get to make. I don't want to wear a mask. I have a right not to wear a mask. Well, I don't want to take the vaccine. I don't trust the vaccine. So then you have the cultural, for many of our students, the history and distrust around the healthcare system that is also a variable. So not even thinking about just the people variables and the resource variables, but then, or the physical people variables, but the internal perspectives that people have a right to bring to the table. And as someone who's trained as a clinical psychologist in creating safe or brave spaces for folks, I want people to feel heard. But I also know that the science is telling me something different from, the fact that, example, we are currently going through our religious exemption. So we've determined a policy for all faculty and staff that are to be vaccinated. All faculty and staff are to be vaccinated. But we do for religious exemptions and medical exemptions. So we're reviewing those now and considering, but there are examples for religious exemptions for various religions where, how do we approve or base that? You've met the policy, the spirit of the policy, right, but the policy was written with an understanding around certain religious doctrine. Your approach or reason why you want a religious exemption is not because your faith said it, but it's because your faith leader is providing their perspective on something. So there's a difference between, so then we're making all of these really kind of subjective choices. And so I think that, colleges and universities right now are having I think this is one of the most challenging times in our history to do things that are fair and equitable, but also the safest. As I mentioned, work at a historically Black college. So all of our folks are Black and brown, and with a few folks who aren't, but for the majority, I feel really blessed to be at a space where at least we're thinking about those things in the forefront as we're trying to make these decisions around, what's impacting our community. But it has not been easy. But Dr. Banks's point about going with the science, but as a psychologist, also thinking about the people needs at the same time has been a challenge for me.
That has to be a challenge. No, please go, Dr. Barlow.
And I'll jump in and say, as a psychologist and a public health scientist, right? Like that's what this last year, I think I've brought to at least my particular department, is the science is very clear. Where I am in DC, like I think one thing we have to think about is where you're located, what's happening socially, politically, and structurally. So here in DC, our numbers for COVID, now I think we're at 54,000 total. That's how many people were diagnosed in the city of DC. Should be a state, but that's a whole other conversation. And so that tells you something there. Here in DC, for the most part, most people don't complain about masks, et cetera. Like I see the rest of the world having issues, but it's different here. Requirements at GW, where I work, is that by August 1st, staff, faculty, and students had to be vaccinated, right? Because we know that the current major vaccines, in terms of testing, that if you take a test, it lasts about a month. Epidemiology has taught us that. We know that. So those who are vaccinated, we're tested, we're required to be tested monthly. It's connected to our cards that are connected to the buildings. So contact tracing. We know that 4% of our student population and faculty population, it's actually more faculty who aren't vaccinated. I think we're like 92%. But only 4% of our students are not vaccinated for medical reasons, but they have to get weekly tests. And so I feel confident in going into the classroom because it's also required in DC, anybody indoors, regardless of vaccination status, has to have a mask on. It's been like that for a month. Once our numbers started going back up, that's what they instituted. So going into the classroom, I've always been double masked, right? Because I wear my N95 and then I figure that extra 2 or 3% is covered by my cloth mask. Wash my hands, I spray everything, I air out everything. And so I think it's important to use the science, right? But if you are in, like, I feel for you, Dr. Lundy.
I'm in Texas.
Ma'am, I didn't want to say it.
You're in a state that I could not live in right now, honestly, given everything. I've lost family members to this disease, okay? And as a result of that, even before this, I was saying that, but as a result of that, I think about how this all could have been preventable. We could have handled all of my public health training, and I fell out of it. All of it has taught me we could have knocked this out in 3 months had we done everything back in March and made sure, and if we had a vaccine at the time. And so, as Dr. Banks said, the science, to understand that they've been doing research on this vaccine, on coronaviruses for years. And so we know the majority of it. This vaccine is in response to COVID-19, but we're looking at it, it's holding up against every variant. But if you know anything about history, you know that viruses, bacteria, they were here before humans were here. And guess what? Gosh darn it, they're going to be here after humans are gone.
They're resilient.
They are resilient. COVID is not going anywhere. But if you want to stay here, get vaccinated. Tell your friends to get vaccinated because each iteration means that less and less people are getting vaccinated. And this thing is smart. It's trying to stay alive. That host, and then it mutates. We're getting to the point, like they suspect the Lambda and the Eta variant, that they're going to be vaccine resistant. I don't want to see a world where we have, and this is just, I really honestly think this is a test case to see how the world handles this. There's going to be another disease. That's what human nature tells us, that we won't have a vaccine for, and we're going to lose even more people. So the best thing we can do is understand and trust our scientists, our true scientists, not people who say they're scientists, but people who are actually trained in infectious disease and epidemiology, who understand all of these things.
I was saying,
when we had, oh no, please go.
I was just saying, I said no to something you said, not because I disagree, but because folks don't believe, or many of the students that I'm serving, they don't believe the science has been around. Somehow we're not trusting the science when we always trust the science. Somehow we're saying, well, it's not FDA approved, but it is now. It's not FDA approved, but you put makeup on your face that's not FDA approved. You take multivitamins that are not FDA approved. You drink the drinks, there's this idea that now everything needs to be FDA approved. Well, there's a level of misinformation that is frustrating for me. But I'm good at not express. I don't let, what did you call her? What's your irritable person, Dr. Banks?
She's called Cranky Banks. She comes out once.
So I don't know. I don't let, when people give misinformation with such fervor, I don't let my cranky side come out. I listen, because I think sometimes people feel some of that resistance to the science is really about not feeling like they have agency and that they're being heard. And so I think if you're in a space where you are like me and surrounded by folks who are driven by misinformation and then just spreading it. I was talking to a group of students. I was talking to about 50 students. And one student read a part of a CDC article and said, well, today, what about the fact that they said that the CDC said that folks who are vaccinated are super spreaders? So he said this amongst his teammates, talking to the baseball team. And he was adamant about how right he was after having read a portion of a sentence of an article. And I had to have a teachable moment with him about the impact of our words, our language, and how we communicate, where we were able to kind of go through the article together from an inquisitive place where I listened to him, but had I not been there for that misinformation, that would have been 50 students on campus who now believe, well, I'm not going to get vaccinated because if I get it, it will actually make the virus spread more. And so I say all that to say that, yes, go with the science, but I think we have to, Dr. Barlow, use our psychological powers or training to allow folks to say, okay, there's something behind the fact that you are so embedded in this way or this resistance. And although it for me doesn't make sense, I want to give you space to kind of tell me where that's coming from so that we can hopefully work to get you to a place where you can make a healthier decision for yourself and also for the community around you.
I pull out a lot of my, I'm sorry. I'm going to mute. Please go ahead, Dr. Barlow.
I just want to add, you know what, and Dr. Lundy, because of everything, and it could be, I am extra sensitive to family that I've lost to this disease. I'm actually at the point that I don't need to hear the voices anymore. I'm at the point where people are making the best decisions for them. And if it is your choice not to get vaccinated, I don't think it's about fighting them on that. I think the larger issue is understanding the why they don't want to get vaccinated.
That's
where the focus should be. I don't have the patience for that right now. That's why I'm glad I'm not a clinical psychologist.
I get told that on a daily. I don't understand how you're so patient, because I have a colleague who, unfortunately, we've had instances where people have known they've had COVID, not reported it, and then walked around campus, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And then so my colleague, like you, has had this experience of losing family members and they themselves almost passed from COVID. And so sitting with the folks who are not vaccinated and then putting other folks at risk has been really challenging for that colleague. And that colleague pulled me aside and said, I don't see how you're being patient. And I have lost family members to COVID as well. But so for me, I recognize that in the moments where I haven't been as patient, folks shut down, they don't hear. And if my goal is for as many people to make the healthy decisions that we want and know they need to make. And then at the end of the day, though, that other colleague was just like, well, they don't have to be here. If they choose not to make some of those choices. And that's
exactly what's happening. And I think getting back to the original question, whoever's trying to figure out what they have to do to go back in the classroom, you have to do what's best for you. So I have a friend who's recovering from cancer and teaches here at Howard and was just like, I'm not going in that classroom, but is experiencing some pushback. Right. So you have to do what's best for you to make sure that you're safe. And if that means, what I've decided to do is if I'm required to teach, I'm going to teach. I'll be double masked up. I will talk slowly so you can understand me through the mask, but I'm not doing anything else one-on-one. Office hours are online. All of my other meetings are online. So you have to figure out what those boundaries are. And mask, even if you're not, like, even if people don't get vaccinated, wear a mask. Forget what Busta Rhymes said, wear a mask.
That goes back to, we're down to the last 6 minutes, y'all. That goes back to me, and perhaps this is me as a military child. Public health decision-making is very clear. And so if there's an environment where people can walk around and not have to disclose their status and possibly infect other people, that to me is not really public health decision-making. For me, we should.
So let me be clear. I'm not saying that, no, this person was breaking all kinds of rules, and
it's not even only your school.
That is not, that is, they, folks are having to disclose. We are walking around. No. So it is, yeah. I want to be clear.
I have heard from teachers. I've heard from teachers who teach children, and I've heard from teachers who teach college students that they don't have to disclose. If the students or the children get COVID, their parents don't have to disclose, or the students themselves don't have to discllose. And that would shake my soul. And you're
Texas,
right, Jameta.
That's the rule in Texas, though. Actually, that's the legislation that has passed. The legislation in Texas says that you don't have to.
Yep, exactly. It's
but on this private college campus, you do.
And that's why it's so important for
what you have
control over to create those boundaries for what you have control over. And again, I'm grateful to be living where I'm living, because I would have moved if I could have.
Yeah, that'd be a tough.
I don't know how I would have handled that.
One more thing I want to say before we log off, and Jameta, I've certainly gotten to that place where I'm not going to repeat the same thing 11 times to folks. Like, I've explained to you that this mRNA technology has been used for decades. Coronaviruses are not new. That's why if you flip around the Lysol bottle and it says it kills coronaviruses, it's because they've been here. They have been here. This is coronavirus. This is the SARS that we have now. That is COVID-19. That's which coronavirus it is. But what I do in the spirit of trying to understand where people are is put on my research hat, my qualitative researcher hat. And I was thinking about a conversation I had with a friend who still is not vaccinated. And what that person said to me was that, I've never gotten sick. I don't even get flu shots. And I was like, oh, okay. No, I didn't get flu shots for a while either, but how did you know you weren't sick? And the person was like, I wasn't sick. I didn't get the flu. And I said, well, how do you know you didn't get the flu? I didn't have any symptoms. And I said, okay, so this is an asymptomatic disease. So you can walk around with COVID and have it and have no clue that you have it and spread it to other people. They have no clue that you had it. They can become asymptomatic carriers. So at basic, you need to test to know whether you have it or not. No one can walk around on this good green planet right now and say, I don't have COVID, or not unless you've had a test. And not unless you're outside of an incubation window, which when the virus came out was 8 to 10 days. The only way that you could say you're walking around and you're COVID negative is if you've had a COVID negative test. And so and what I explained to that person was that don't confuse not having symptoms or losing your taste or coughing. If you're waiting for that, that may never come. And so the safe thing at minimum to do is to test, unless you're sitting at home in a bubble. And the science is clear. And I love what Dr. Rowley said in the very first drop-in hours. And she said, someone asked if Dr. Bill Jenkins was here. This is the whistleblower for the Tuskegee syphilis study. They asked, what would he say? And she said, now, Bill is a statistician. Jameta went to Spelman. He's out of Morehouse.
He was my first public health professor.
The EMOTEP program there. HBCU Pride, Xavier, Spelman, and FAMU. She said, Bill, from a numbers perspective, she said, Bill's a statistician. What he would say is the probability of harm from COVID-19 versus the probability of harm from the vaccine is a no-brainer. And I've said that on a few sessions now. Numbers wise, it is a no-brainer. And then she said, comma, it is still a personal decision. We have to help people navigate through that. But the science and the numbers are pretty clear. And if folks need more information on that, I highly encourage you to go watch last month's session. In addition to this, we planned this and segged with this mental health piece at the very, very end. Because we thought this would be important as people were digesting the information. Dr. Barlow and Dr. Lundy, we have 2 more minutes. If you want to take 30 seconds to drop the mic, just tell people one thing you want them to walk away with in the context of thriving, because we know we are on the top of wave number 4. and a pandemic that you said so appropriately could have been nipped in the bud very early, but here we are. What is one thing you want the people to walk away with?
Oh, go ahead.
No, okay.
Oh, so there are two things actually. So the one thing I will say is you are going to be okay to tap into your inner resources, your ancestral resources. I always like to leave people with 5-7-9. It's been clinically proven. They're different modalities, but it's been clinically proven to decrease cortisol over time. Breathe in for 5 seconds, hold for 7 seconds, and let it out for 9 seconds. Why is that important? It's decreasing cortisol, activating your parasympathetic nervous system, as we were saying earlier, which over long-term can decrease your risk for hypertension, obesity, chronic diseases, such as cardiovascular disease. The other thing I would say is to make sure you wear a mask, to find joy in this world, despite all of the chaos.
Mm-hmm. Got the mic. All right, Dr. Lundy.
I'd like to say that I think self-care is an act of love. And you are so deserving of the love you give to others. And so as we talked about today, I would encourage everyone to think of this as a shift from the idea that we have to earn love to give ourselves, and recognize that it is a right that you have. And that with that right, if we are intentional about nurturing ourselves and asking that question, what is it I need in this moment? That in doing so, I think we can move from surviving to thriving.
Drop the mic, y'all. I appreciate both of you. Huge kudos to the team for continuing to make magic happen with drop-in hours. Huge thank you to the Ride United partnership and the collaborative for supporting these health literacy sessions to make sure that folks understand what's going on in this pandemic. For the people who are in pursuit of a vaccine, who have made the informed decision and thought through the decision for the vaccine for themselves, Ride United has an opportunity for you to get round trip transportation. Very easy. Call the telephone number, it's scheduled for you round trip. And of course, because we are simultaneously translating things, it's also in Spanish. So we thank you for attending this series. We'll be back on September 22nd. Surprise, you're the first to know if you're on our email list. Make sure that you check your inbox in about a week or so, and follow us on social media. Don't Be a Host on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And want to thank our amazing experts for dropping in. Found him at All About Alfia or the Self-Care Doc on Instagram, or Ray Lundy on Twitter. Have a wonderful evening. Be great. Continue to thrive. We'll make sure we got all of the things turned off.